and welcome. I'm Ashley of The Ugly Sheep, and today we're going to make a jacket out of gnome fabric. I got this fabric from Joann's before it closed, and I've been delaying making a jacket because I've never done that before. But today's the day. We're going to get this done and be able to wear our cuddly gnome fabric, and I can't be more excited. The first step of this project is to cut out all of the pieces of the pattern. And this is where things first started to go wrong. The pattern called for cutting out piece 13, but really what it meant for me to cut out was piece 12. Now this isn't a big deal because I didn't need the piece 12 anyway, because my jacket was so thick that I don't think my machine would have been able to handle putting on the flap behind the zipper. Once all my pattern pieces were cut out, it was time to put them on my fabric for the outer part of the jacket and to cut out each part. And yes, I am using teacups for weights for my fabric. It was just way too thick to try and put pins in it, and the teacups worked just fine. Despite how thick the fabric is, it was actually really easy to cut. And because it's slightly fuzzy, it did not shift around on itself. So keeping the layer that's folded over even as I cut was actually surprisingly easy. The next step is to cut out the lining for the jacket. And yes, I'm still using the teacups, but this time it's just because I was way too lazy to go downstairs and get my pins. This lining is a linen fabric that I've had laying around for a little while now, and it just happened to match the tan parts of the gnomes in the fabric, so I thought it was a perfect use for this fabric. The pattern has you do the pockets first, so you do some loose stitching around the bottom part of the pocket so that you can pull the edges in nicely and neatly. This ended up not working really well for me, probably because of how thick my fabric is. I just couldn't pull the thread through it to gather the curves of the bottom part of the pocket. Instead, I just ended up clipping everything in place really well so that I could sew the top part of the pocket down as instructed before applying it to the front of the jacket. Once the pockets were prepped, I then pinned the pocket onto the front of each side of the jacket, and then I sewed it down using a top stitch. As you can see with me pulling out all of the clips and pins in this, I used a lot in order to keep it shape while I was sewing. I would rather have to stop frequently to take the pins out and the clips off in order to keep the shape than to be struggling and fiddling with it as I was going around the curve, trying to keep everything under and straight. Once the pockets were sewn on, I sewed the front right and the front left of the jacket onto the back. And that actually lined up really well with this pattern. I was surprised. I'm not sure if it's because the fabric didn't really stretch or shift, but I've rarely had a pattern match up as nicely as this one did. Next, I sewed up the sleeves. These are a little bit different shapes of the sleeves, and I had to make sure to keep the bottom part of the sleeve unstitched so that I could add the elastic later. Throughout this whole project, I'm actually using white thread. It matches the white on the gnomes and provides a nice contrast on the lining, but you really cannot see the thread on the actual outside of the jacket, so I don't think it really mattered if I picked a color that was on the jacket print at all. Now that the sleeves are on, I can put the top part of the yoke on the jacket. This jacket has some style lines in it, and if I wanted to, there was a pattern to do stripes on one side in the yoke and not in the other. I chose to keep my fabric the same throughout. I had plenty of fabric, and I really love this fabric, so I didn't bother with the different striping. I just did the style lines that were in the pattern. At this point, though, it starts getting really hard to get everything through the sewing machine because the jacket is getting really heavy at this point. And my sewing setup is not ideal, but even having brought something to lay the jacket on next to me, it definitely was challenging to make sure that everything got through smoothly and evenly without pulling. Now that the jacket is mostly together, it's time to put the collar together. So you're supposed to use interfacing on the bottom part of the collar. However, my fabric was so thick that I did not bother. And once everything was completely put together, you really can't tell that it does not have the extra stability of the iron-on interfacing that's supposed to be there. In this case, I don't think it would have made too much of a difference other than making it harder to put through my sewing machine later. After basting the collar onto the jacket, it's time to install the zipper. I did not change to my zipper foot for this. The zipper I chose to use was plastic and had plastic kind of fabric, if you will, to attach the zipper to your project. So I did it this way. With it being so thick, it's not a huge deal, and this gave me a chance to go back over it closer to the zipper if I needed to, because I was not sure how my machine would handle the zipper fabric. And the answer to how did my machine handle the zipper fabric? Not well. I didn't like the sound of it, and my machine struggled a little bit with going through the plastic fabric. Once the zipper was on the shell of the jacket, it was time to assemble the lining. The lining steps are pretty much identical to the outer part of the jacket, except I'm not going to put a zipper on, and I'm not going to put a collar on for the lining. The collar is actually 2 strips of the fashion fabric on the outside. The lining also does not have any pockets, but I kind of wish I had put some on because I had plenty of fabric to do so, and having some pockets on the inside would have been really nice. Once the lining was sewn, I pinned everything right side together along the collar line and sewed the lining and the jacket and the collar all together in one go. I was a little nervous about this because it had such a hard time going over the seams of the fabric, but all 4 layers of fleece and the layer of linen was not a problem. I think it's because when the machine was going over the seams, the adjustment in height was so different that it was getting caught instead of smoothly gliding over the fabric like it would normally do. But the collar was all 4 of the layers of fleece and the layer of linen in one continuous go, no seams or foldovers, and I think it just managed that much better without the height adjustment. So on the pattern pieces, it says to cut the lining shorter than the outer fabric, but in the instructions, it instructs you to sew the bottom hem of the fabrics, both the lining and the outer fabric, together. Obviously, I cut the lining shorter because I did not read all of the instructions before I put this together. And so I just elected to make the lining a floating lining at the bottom. And I'm hand sewing this because I just am not able to wrestle with keeping such a small, even hem with the weight of the jacket on the sewing machine. If I make this jacket again, I actually might cut both the fabric and the lining a little longer to give myself more room for the hemming, because if I'm sewing everything together and then I have to roll up the hem to make a channel for the elastic, it's just not going to be enough room with where the zipper was placed. But because my fashion fabric doesn't fray, this ended up not being a huge problem in this case because I didn't need to do any treatment of raw edges. It was just the lining fabric that I had to make sure I rolled the hem twice to keep it from fraying at the bottom. The bottom hem of the jacket is also going to be the channel for the elastic along the bottom of the jacket. And so you flip it up 1.25 inches. With this fabric, I probably should have done 1.5 inches or maybe even 1.75 inches to give myself more room in the channel, because this fabric is so thick and fuzzy that it just did not like having the elastic put through it. Once the channel was sewn, I passed the elastic through, but it was very challenging. I think the hem on the bottom was just a little too narrow for this kind of fabric. And so when it came to finishing the sleeves, I decided not to put elastic in them for 2 reasons. One, this was so painful to get through that I just decided I didn't want to do it again. And 2, this jacket is going to be like my basement crafting jacket, so I don't want my shirt that I'm wearing under the jacket to be all bunched up on the sleeves as I'm moving and extending my arms, so I just decided to leave it off. Once the elastic was on, I sewed both sides of the lining down. I did the first side by machine, but it really did not like going through all of the layers and that plasticky fabric layer for the zipper. So for the second side, I just whip stitched it in place along the length of the zipper, and if I do this again, I will absolutely just from the start do this. It prevents there from being a lot of stitching lines, and it was just so much easier and faster this way. The last step, because I decided to not put any elastic in the sleeves, I just rolled the sleeves up for a double hem, about 2 inches that's rolled up, so 1 inch, and then rolled it again for 1 inch, and whip stitched it from the lining to the cuff so that there's no visible stitching on the outside. Probably not that big of an issue for the visible stitching, and more of it was easier to not have to go through all of the bulk. I love this jacket. I'm very happy about how it turned out. There are a few things I would do differently next time. like I chose not to use the elastic around the sleeves, so I'd make them a little thinner. And if I decided to do the elastic again, I would cut everything longer to give me more space to put the elastic through, or I just wouldn't use the elastic because it was really hard to get through in the fleece. I'd also probably not pick a plastic zipper. I thought it looked really cute and it does zip, but my machine did not like the plastic that is the fabric on the side of the zipper. But overall, I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I'm surprised that my sewing machine handled all of this because there were some questions there. But gnomes are like my ideal jacket. They are my thing. What would your ideal jacket print be? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe.